So, you think you know The Exorcist. Head spinning like a merry-go-round on steroids, green soup projectiles that look suspiciously like something you get after bad Taco Bell, a poor little girl dropping more F-bombs than a Quentin Tarantino marathon. That's the version most people remember. A shocking, gross-out, demon versus priest showdown. A film so notorious that audiences fainted, theaters handed out bath bags, and critics called it the scariest movie ever made. But here's the part Hollywood never told you. Behind the spinning head and the pea soup lies something far older, far stranger, and far more unsettling. A story that begins not in a Georgetown bedroom, but in the sands of ancient Mesopotamia, thousands of years before Catholic priests ever learned the rite of exorcism. Because the demon in The Exorcist, he wasn't just some random Hollywood invention. His name is Pazuzu. And if that sounds like something you'd hear from a Pokemon trainer, don't be fooled. Pazuzu was very real in the mythology of ancient Mesopotamia. He had a face only a demonologist could love, a snarling lion, dog hybrid with bulging eyes, wings, and claws. He was invoked to protect against plagues and evil spirits, especially a rival demoness named Lamashtu. Yes, you heard that right. The big bad in The Exorcist was originally a kind of guardian. So how did we get from there to a possessed 12-year-old named Regan cussing out priests in a split-level home? That's where the real fun begins. Because The Exorcist wasn't just a film. It was a cultural earthquake. The book, the movie, and the panic that followed tapped into something deep in the modern psyche. Fear of losing control, fear of science failing us, fear of faith not being enough. Think about it. Before The Exorcist, most people associated horror with rubber monsters, haunted castles, or maybe a vampire in a cape. After The Exorcist, horror wasn't just spooky fun anymore. It was sacred, taboo, dangerous. This was a movie that made priests field real phone calls from terrified parishioners convinced their kids' mood swings meant they were possessed. Hospitals reported faintings. Even the Vatican had to comment on it. And here's the kicker. The whole thing was based on a so-called true story. In 1949, a boy in Maryland reportedly underwent a series of Catholic exorcisms, strange words carved into his skin. Furniture moving on its own, priests swore it was real. Reporters wrote it up. William Peter Blatty, a student at Georgetown at the time, never forgot it. 2 decades later, he turned that story into a novel. And then William Friedkin turned the novel into the infamous 1973 film that had audiences fainting in the aisles. Which brings us to the real question of this video. Who really is Pazuzu? Where does this demon come from? And why did a story about a little girl in Washington, D.C. unleash a global panic that still haunts us today? Because, make no mistake, The Exorcist wasn't just a movie, it was a cultural possession. Long before Hollywood discovered the marketing power of a spinning head and projectile vomit, the demon at the heart of The Exorcist already had a long and complicated resume. His name was Pazuzu, and in the mythology of ancient Mesopotamia, he was not just some generic monster of the week. He was the king of the wind demons, a bringer of plagues, droughts, and misfortune, and, paradoxically, also a protector. If that sounds contradictory, welcome to the world of ancient demonology, where good and evil weren't cleanly divided into the black and white categories we're used to in modern religion. Pazuzu's appearance alone tells you everything you need to know about his role. His body was a collage of nightmares. He had a canine face with sharp fangs, bulging eyes that never blinked, the wings of a bird, the claws of a lion, and the tail of a scorpion. Imagine every animal you would least want in your bedroom at night, stitched together into a single being. He wasn't the kind of figure you would hang on your wall for comfort. And yet, that's exactly what people did. Archaeologists have discovered amulets and statuettes of Pazuzu that were carried by women and families, not to summon him, but to invoke his protection. Because in the cruel logic of ancient belief, sometimes the only thing strong enough to ward off evil was another evil. Pazuzu's greatest enemy was a demoness named Lamashtu. Unlike him, she wasn't interested in balance. She was a devourer, a predator, and above all a danger to mothers and newborns. In Mesopotamian belief, Lamashtu crept into homes to strangle infants, poison breast milk, and ruin pregnancies. To guard against her, families turned to Pazuzu. They would wear his amulet around a mother's neck, place his image on a bedpost, or recite incantations calling on him to drive Lamashtu away. This duality is what makes Pazuzu so fascinating. He wasn't purely a villain. He was dangerous, but he could also be harnessed as a force of protection. And this idea that demons could be both destroyers and defenders was central to Mesopotamian demonology as a whole. For them, demons weren't fallen angels in rebellion against a single god. They were forces of chaos, spirits of disease, misfortune, or natural disaster. Some were malicious, others neutral, and some could even be turned to human advantage if approached correctly. Ancient Mesopotamians developed a whole toolkit of rituals, charms, and prayers to handle them. Amulets were one of the most common tools. These weren't decorative trinkets, but sacred technologies, carefully inscribed with symbols, names of deities, or images of protective figures. Carrying an amulet was like carrying a spiritual shield. They also relied on ritual incantations, often performed by priests called ashipu, specialists in magic and healing. These priests would stand at the boundary between the human and the supernatural, reciting long prayers to command, banish, or negotiate with spirits. They even used figurines of demons, crafted in clay or metal, to capture or bind hostile forces, like a kind of ancient ghost trap. Exorcism in this world wasn't about a single dramatic showdown between good and evil. It was more like a negotiation, a set of spiritual hacks designed to rebalance the unseen forces affecting a person's health, mind, or luck. Illness, madness, infertility, these could all be blamed on hostile demons. A ritual might involve cleansing with water, burning incense, or even transferring the affliction into an object or an animal, which would then be banished or destroyed. The line between medicine, magic, and religion was blurry, and the role of the priest was to navigate that liminal space. Over time, these practices didn't just stay in Mesopotamia, they filtered outward. Jewish traditions of exorcism show clear echoes of the same worldview. In the Hebrew Bible, there are references to unclean spirits and destructive angels. The Book of Tobit describes the demon Asmodeus, who kills the husbands of a woman named Sarah until the angel Raphael shows her how to drive him away using a ritual involving fish organs and incense. That story may sound strange to modern ears, but it fits neatly into the same tradition of tangible, ritual-based exorcisms that Mesopotamians had practiced for centuries. By the time Christianity emerged, the idea of possession by spirits had become a well-known cultural script. In the New Testament, Jesus is depicted as performing exorcisms as part of his ministry. He confronts men tormented by legions of demons, drives unclean spirits into a herd of pigs, and commands them with divine authority to depart. These stories aren't random miracles. They reflect a deep continuity with older Near Eastern ideas. Illness and madness could be the result of spiritual invasion, and the cure was confrontation with a higher power. Early Christian communities continued this tradition. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, church fathers were already writing about the power of invoking Christ's name to cast out spirits. Unlike the long incantations of Mesopotamian priests, these exorcisms emphasized simplicity. The authority of Christ alone was enough. And as Christianity grew, so did the institutionalization of this practice. Priests were trained not just in theology, but in the rituals of banishing spirits, often blending older folk practices with official liturgy. When Catholicism eventually formalized the rite of exorcism, it was building on this layered history. The Roman ritual, a handbook first published in the 17th century, contains detailed instructions for performing an exorcism, prayers, holy water, the sign of the cross, and invocations of saints. The priest commands the demon in the name of God and the Church, demanding its departure. This was the Catholic answer to millennia of demonic belief, codifying into Latin what Mesopotamian priests and Jewish healers had done with amulets and chants. But there's a crucial difference. In Christianity, demons weren't seen as ambiguous forces that could be protective in the right context. They were absolutely evil, fallen angels in rebellion against God. The grey areas of Mesopotamian demonology were painted over with stark dualism, good on one side, evil on the other. The protector demon Pazuzu, with his complicated moral status, didn't fit neatly into that worldview, which is partly why his appearance in The Exorcist was so shocking. He brought with him the echo of a much older, stranger religious imagination. This layering of traditions is exactly what makes The Exorcist such a fascinating case study. When audiences watched Regan MacNeil twist in bed and scream obscenities, they weren't just watching a story about one demon. They were witnessing a collision between ancient Mesopotamian folklore, Jewish and Christian exorcism traditions, and modern fears about science and faith. Pazuzu wasn't just a villain invented for shock value. He was a relic of humanity's oldest attempts to understand suffering, illness, and evil itself. Think about the irony. The same demon that ancient mothers once called upon to protect their babies from harm ended up reimagined as the predator of a modern child on the big screen. The very amulets that once symbolized hope for families became the hidden Easter eggs in a movie designed to terrify those same families centuries later. When Regan's mother begged doctors and priests alike to save her daughter, she was unknowingly reenacting rituals that Mesopotamian parents had performed thousands of years earlier, hoping that a priest, a god, or even a demon could restore balance. And here's the twist. The Catholic rite of exorcism, though it looks so different from Mesopotamian rituals, was shaped by that same logic. Both traditions believed that words have power. Both saw illness as more than just physical. Both assumed that the human body could become a battleground for unseen forces. Whether through an Ashipu chanting in Akkadian, a Jewish healer burning incense, or a Catholic priest invoking Christ, the goal was the same: to name the spirit, confront it, and cast it out. So when William Friedkin's camera zoomed in on the anguished face of a young girl, when the priests in the film shouted prayers against the unseen presence, audiences weren't just seeing a fictional possession. They were tapping into a very old memory encoded into human culture. The fear that the body is vulnerable to more than germs and wounds. The fear that something invisible, ancient, and malicious can crawl inside, take hold, and refuse to leave. Pazuzu may have been a Mesopotamian wind demon, a strange protector in the deserts of Babylon, but through The Exorcist, he became the face of modern horror. A symbol not only of possession, but of the deep continuity between humanity's oldest myths and our most modern nightmares. In the winter of 1949, in a quiet suburb of Maryland, a boy began to make headlines that wouldn't officially surface until decades later. He was anonymous in the records, identified only by pseudonyms like Robbie Mannheim or Roland Doe. But his story would ripple through the Catholic Church, the medical community, and eventually into pop culture history as the spark that lit the fire of The Exorcist. It began innocently enough, at least on the surface. Robbie was described as a quiet, lonely 13-year-old. He spent much of his time with an aunt who was interested in spiritualism, Ouija boards, and the kind of parlor games that seemed like harmless fun in the mid-20th century. After her death, Robbie's family began to notice strange things happening in their home. Objects moved on their own. Furniture scraped across the floor without anyone touching it. The boy claimed he could hear scratching sounds in the walls, and soon, The activity began to center around him directly. The reports grew stranger. His mattress would shake violently as he tried to sleep. Words and symbols seemed to appear on his skin as if carved by invisible hands. Witnesses claimed to see the word Louis appear, which the family took as a sign to take him to St. Louis, where they had relatives and hoped to find help. At first, doctors were consulted. Psychiatrists examined the boy. None could offer an explanation that satisfied his desperate parents. Eventually, the family turned to their Lutheran minister, who then referred them to the Catholic Church. This is where the story leaves the territory of folklore and becomes a matter of documented record. Jesuit priests at St. Louis University became involved, and a diary was kept by Father Raymond Bishop, one of the attending clergy. His notes describe a grueling series of exorcism attempts lasting weeks. He recorded that Robbie would scream in guttural voices, lash out violently, and react with fury to holy water and prayers. He wrote that the boy vomited, cursed, and exhibited strength far beyond his age. One entry even describes the appearance of scratches spelling the word hell across his chest. Over 30 priests were either witnesses or participants at various stages of the case. Father William Bowden was the lead exorcist, reportedly enduring nightly battles that left him physically and emotionally drained. According to the diary, the climactic moment came after weeks of struggle, when the boy supposedly shouted out that the demon had been defeated by the power of Saint Michael the Archangel. In that moment, the room fell silent, and Robbie collapsed into calmness. The exorcism was declared a success, and the boy was released from church care. He went on to live an ordinary life, with his identity carefully protected by the church. Whether one believes every detail or not, what matters is the impression it left. This wasn't a whispered legend passed from villager to villager. This was a modern case in the middle of the United States, documented by educated priests and observed by witnesses in hospitals and churches. Word of the case spread through clerical circles, whispered among Jesuits, passed to students at Georgetown University, and eventually reaching the ears of a young man named William Peter Blatty. Blatty was a student at Georgetown in the 1950s when he first heard the rumors. He later described being haunted by the story for years. By the time he began writing fiction, the idea of possession, filtered through both the modern case and his own Catholic upbringing, provided fertile ground. What made it even more powerful was the way it could merge the immediacy of a contemporary event with the weight of ancient religious symbolism. In 1971, Blatty published The Exorcist, a novel that took the bones of the Maryland case and transformed them into a theological horror story. Instead of a boy, he made the victim a young girl, Regan MacNeil, intensifying the vulnerability and emotional stakes. Instead of scattered diary entries, he built a narrative of two priests, Father Merrin and Father Karras, who embody both tradition and doubt. Merrin is the experienced exorcist, a man who has seen the face of evil before. Karras is the skeptic, a priest wrestling with his fading faith and his mother's death. Together, they confront not just a demon, but the very question of whether faith can withstand the realities of evil. Blatty's genius was in weaving together threads from three sources. From the Maryland case, he took the raw material, violent outbursts, carved words on flesh, objects moving on their own. From Catholic theology, he borrowed the ritual structure and the spiritual stakes of exorcism. And from ancient lore, he layered in Pazuzu, a real Mesopotamian demon whose grotesque visage gave the story a timeless mythological anchor. This combination of modern horror, Catholic ritual, and ancient mythology made The Exorcist unlike anything else in literature. It wasn't just a ghost story. It was a story that dared to ask if the devil was real, and if modern people were equipped to face him. The novel struck a chord. It became a bestseller almost instantly, shocking readers with its graphic depictions of possession, its theological depth, and its refusal to offer easy answers. Blatty himself insisted it wasn't simply a horror story but a tale of faith, a parable about the existence of good and evil. That tension between entertainment and spiritual confrontation was exactly what gave the book its staying power. When the story eventually moved to film, those layers would become even more explosive. But even before the cameras rolled, Blatty's work had already accomplished something remarkable. By blending a mid-century case of alleged possession with centuries-old demonology, he created a story that felt both modern and eternal. A story that could frighten skeptics and believers alike. It's easy to look back now and reduce The Exorcist to its pop culture tropes: spinning heads, levitating beds, and foul-mouthed children. But at its core, the reason it terrified millions was because it didn't feel like a fantasy. It felt like something that could, and maybe did, happen. A suburban family, a real priest's diary, and an ancient demon dragged from the sands of Mesopotamia into a Washington, D.C. bedroom. That was the alchemy William Peter Blatty achieved. And it's why The Exorcist, in both novel and film, has endured. By tethering modern fear to ancient mythology, Blatty ensured that Pazuzu would not just be a forgotten museum artifact, but a household name. A demon reborn, whose legend would spread not through temples or amulets, but through bookstores, theaters, and living rooms worldwide. When William Peter Blatty sold the rights to his best-selling novel, he was adamant that the adaptation couldn't be just another horror film. He wanted something faithful to the spirit of the book, something that would carry the same weight of theology, terror, and seriousness that had made the novel stand out. Enter William Friedkin, a director already gaining a reputation for his bold, uncompromising style after his gritty police thriller The French Connection. Friedkin wasn't a horror director by trade, and that was precisely why he was chosen. He had an eye for realism, for immediacy, for capturing something that felt like it was happening right in front of you. That approach would turn The Exorcist into a cultural phenomenon. From the beginning, Friedkin insisted on grounding the supernatural in the everyday. Instead of Gothic castles or shadowy landscapes, the film's horrors unfold in an ordinary Georgetown home. The lighting is stark, the dialogue feels natural. Even the most outrageous scenes are shot with the cold precision of a documentary. That decision made every shocking moment land with 10 times the impact. Because when something impossible happens in a world that looks exactly like your own, it feels less like fiction and more like invasion. Of course, behind the camera, nothing about the production was ordinary. Friedkin's set became infamous, not only for its grueling demands, but for the rumors that it was cursed. Accidents piled up. A set built to replicate the MacNeil home caught fire, destroying nearly everything except Regan's bedroom. Ellen Burstyn, who played Chris MacNeil, injured her spine when Friedkin demanded that a violent pull on a harness not be softened. Linda Blair, only 12 years old at the time, endured hours of makeup, freezing conditions, and physical strain from mechanical rigs. 9 deaths were connected to the cast and crew during the course of production and release, fueling speculation that the film was under some kind of dark influence. Whether coincidence or curse, the rumors only deepened the aura of fear surrounding the movie. Then there were Friedkin's notorious methods. He was known for pushing his actors to extremes. He fired guns on set to elicit genuine startle responses. He slapped a priest across the face before rolling the camera so his performance would carry real shock. This relentless pursuit of authenticity was controversial, but it paid off in the rawness of the final performances. The terror wasn't just in the special effects, it was in the actors' eyes, their strained voices, their exhaustion. And then, of course, there were the scenes that cemented The Exorcist in horror history. The headspin was achieved with an elaborate animatronic puppet of Regan, painstakingly designed to move in grotesque but lifelike ways. When audiences first saw it, many believed it was real. The levitation sequence involved hidden rigs and wires, with Friedkin insisting on long, unbroken takes to prevent the audience from dismissing it as trickery. The infamous crucifix scene, shocking even by today's standards, was one of the most debated moments of the film, condemned by religious leaders, yet impossible to forget. And the exorcism itself, with priests Marin and Karas battling the unseen force, was staged like a ritual, complete with clouds of visible breath achieved by chilling the set to near-freezing temperatures. Every detail worked to blur the line between cinema and reality. The sound design added another layer of psychological assault. Friedkin and his team used distorted animal noises, industrial sounds, and even recordings of bees to create the unnerving growls of the possessed Regan. The iconic use of tubular bells by Mike Oldfield became inseparable from the film, a hauntingly simple melody that evoked both innocence and menace. In theaters, the mix was overwhelming. Audiences didn't just watch the film, they felt it in their bodies. What truly made The Exorcist revolutionary, however, was its refusal to wink at the audience. This was not camp, not satire, not a cheap thrill ride. Friedkin treated the material with utter seriousness, shooting the supernatural events with the same lens he would use for a police procedural or a documentary. That choice forced audiences to confront the story as if it were plausible, maybe even possible. The doctor's examinations of Regan are shot with clinical detail. The priest's doubts are given as much weight as their faith. Every step of the film grounds the incredible in the credible, until by the time you reach the climax, you're no longer sure where reality ends and nightmare begins. The effect on audiences was unprecedented. Reports poured in of viewers fainting in theaters, vomiting in the aisles, or fleeing the screening halfway through. Ambulances were called to cinemas. Churches saw spikes in attendance. Priests reported being contacted by terrified parishioners, convinced they or their loved ones were possessed. The film wasn't just entertainment, it was a phenomenon, shaking people at their deepest levels of belief and fear. Critics, too, were divided. Some hailed it as a masterpiece of modern cinema, a work that elevated horror into serious art. Others condemned it as obscene, exploitative, or even dangerous. The controversy only fueled its success, making it one of the highest-grossing films of its time. In fact, adjusted for inflation, it remains one of the most profitable rated films ever made. Looking back, what Friedkin achieved was nothing short of alchemy. By merging Blatty's theological depth with a relentless commitment to realism, he created a film that didn't just scare people, it haunted them. Unlike monster movies or slasher flicks, The Exorcist made evil feel intimate, invasive, and close to home. It suggested that the greatest horror wasn't in faraway castles or abstract legends, but in the bedroom down the hall, in the fragile body of a child, in the silence of a parent's helplessness. That's why the head spin, the levitation, and the crucifix aren't just shocking images. They're symbols of a deeper dread, that the safe walls of the home can't keep out the darkness, that the institutions we trust, medicine, science, even faith itself, can falter in the face of something we can't understand. Friedkin's documentary-like approach forced that dread into the spotlight, and once audiences saw it, they couldn't unsee it. The result was not only the scariest film of its time, but one of the most important films ever made. The Exorcist redefined what horror could be, pushing it beyond the realm of monsters and shadows into the arena of existential terror. It showed that horror could be serious, that it could grapple with questions of faith, evil, and the human condition, and still leave audiences clutching their seats in fear. Friedkin didn't just direct a film. He conjured a possession of his own, one that seeped into culture, into headlines, into the nightmares of an entire generation. And half a century later, its grip has yet to loosen. When The Exorcist premiered in December of 1973, No one, least of all William Friedkin or William Peter Blatty, could have predicted the cultural detonation it was about to cause. The film was expected to do well, of course. The novel had been a bestseller, and the buzz around the adaptation was strong. But what happened in those first weeks went beyond ordinary box office success. It was hysteria, a phenomenon. Something closer to a collective haunting than a movie release. Audiences poured into theaters, many of them unprepared for what they were about to witness. They thought they were buying a ticket to a scary film, maybe something like Rosemary's Baby or Night of the Living Dead. What they got instead was an assault on their senses, a story that didn't just scare but unsettled them to their core. Within days, reports of fainting and vomiting in theaters were making headlines. Paramedics were dispatched to screenings in cities across the United States. In some places, priests were literally stationed outside theaters to comfort shaken moviegoers. Theaters handed out bath bags as if they were 3D glasses. In Washington, D.C., where the story itself was set, lines wrapped around the block, and yet dozens of people fled the theater midway through, unable to take it. In Chicago, a woman fainted and broke her jaw on the theater seat in front of her, later suing Warner Brothers for damages. Whether these stories were exaggerated by the press or not hardly mattered, the legend was cemented. Watching The Exorcist wasn't just entertainment, it was an ordeal. The Catholic Church, naturally, had a complicated response. On one hand, many church leaders condemned the film as blasphemous, obscene, or dangerous. On the other hand, plenty of priests admitted privately that it was the best thing to happen to their parish numbers in years. Attendance at Mass spiked, and requests for exorcisms, real ones, not movie reenactments, reportedly surged worldwide. The Vatican eventually acknowledged the film's existence not as a source of doctrine, but as a cultural event that had tapped into real anxieties about the presence of evil. For some priests, it was proof that the world still believed in the devil, even in an age of science and skepticism. For others, it was a PR nightmare, a Hollywood circus that cheapened sacred ritual. Secular audiences, meanwhile, were divided in an entirely different way. For some, the film was a metaphor for modern anxieties about the breakdown of the nuclear family, the failure of science to explain everything, the crisis of faith in a post-Vietnam and post-Watergate America. Regan's possession wasn't just a demonic attack, it was symbolic of a society unraveling. The doctors in the film represented the limits of modern medicine, probing and scanning, but unable to help. The priests represented an older authority struggling to maintain relevance in a skeptical age. For many viewers, the horror lay not only in the supernatural, but in the suggestion that neither science nor religion had the power to save us completely. The controversy only grew as the film spread overseas. In the United Kingdom, the British Board of Film Classification gave it an X rating, but the film was still shown widely. Rural towns saw protests, with local councils banning it outright. In Catholic countries such as Italy and Spain, the reaction was even more dramatic. Some theaters in Rome stationed priests in the lobby to bless frightened audiences. In Mexico, church leaders organized protests against it, warning that the film could itself invite demonic influence. In places like Singapore and Malaysia, it was banned altogether, considered too dangerous for public morality. And yet, despite, or perhaps because of, the backlash, the film's success grew. By the end of its run, The Exorcist had broken box office records, grossing over $400 million worldwide, an almost unheard-of figure for a horror film at the time. Adjusted for inflation, it still ranks among the most profitable rated movies ever made. The combination of religious scandal, audience hysteria, and media frenzy transformed it from just another adaptation into a once-in-a-generation cultural event. What made it so different from other horror films of its era was not just the shock value. though the spinning head and projectile vomit certainly helped. It was the seriousness with which it was presented. Friedkin didn't make a fun monster movie. He made something that felt like a documentary, a window into evil. That gravity forced people to take it seriously, whether they wanted to or not. You couldn't dismiss it as just fiction. It lingered. It raised questions. That seriousness also explains why the film became a touchstone rather than a footnote. Horror films come and go, but few change the cultural landscape. The Exorcist tapped into something primal, the fear of losing control, of watching a loved one become unrecognizable, of realizing that neither doctors nor priests can guarantee protection. It reminded modern audiences that beneath the surface of their rational world still lurked ancient terrors, the same demons that haunted humanity in Mesopotamia thousands of years before. Even those who hated the film couldn't ignore it. Critics who called it obscene still had to acknowledge its craftsmanship. Religious leaders who condemned it still found themselves answering questions about possession and exorcism. Parents who tried to shield their children from it still had to deal with the fact that the kids had seen the parodies, the trailers, or the images plastered across newspapers. It wasn't just a film, it was an argument, a provocation, a mirror held up to a world caught between faith and doubt. By the time it left theaters, The Exorcist had done more than break records. It had changed the cultural vocabulary of horror. Suddenly, possession became a household concept. Exorcism, once a little-known Catholic ritual, became headline material. Pazuzu, the obscure Mesopotamian wind demon, became a pop icon, and the line between entertainment and theology had been permanently blurred. That's why The Exorcist remains more than a movie. It was a moment of shock that rippled through culture, forcing believers and skeptics alike to confront their fears. For some, it was proof of Satan. For others, it was proof of society's anxieties in the modern age. But for everyone, it was unforgettable. A film that didn't just play on the screen, but seemed to play in the air, in the pews, in the nightmares of anyone who dared to watch. After the dust settled from the original Exorcist, Hollywood faced the same question it always does when something becomes a phenomenon. How do we bottle that lightning again? The answer, of course, was sequels, spin-offs, and eventually an entire patchwork of reboots and reinterpretations. Some were ambitious, some were laughable, and together they charted the strange afterlife of Pazuzu as a cinematic icon. The first attempt came in 1977 with Exorcist II, The Heretic, directed by John Boorman. If the original was hailed as a masterpiece of grounded terror, the sequel was its polar opposite. Boorman leaned into surrealism and mysticism with dreamlike imagery, African backstories, and a plot that seemed to stretch the idea of possession into cosmic territory. Linda Blair reprised her role as Regan, now a teenager in therapy, but the focus shifted to psychic connections, hypnosis machines, and visions of Father Merrin's earlier encounters with Pazuzu in Africa. The result was a critical disaster. Audiences expecting the raw terror of the original were baffled by locust swarms, bizarre dream sequences, and a plot that made little sense. Roger Ebert famously called it not just bad, but hilariously bad. Still, in its own way, the film revealed something important: the difficulty of sustaining horror once mystery has been stripped away. Pazuzu, who thrived in the shadows of ambiguity, became less frightening when over-explained. Redemption came in 1990 with The Exorcist III, written and directed by William Peter Blatty himself. Based on his novel Legion, it followed Detective Kinderman, a character from the original story, investigating a series of murders linked to the Gemini killer. Unlike the spectacle of the second film, Exorcist III returned to psychological dread, blending crime procedural with theological horror. Its most famous scene, a sudden corridor scare with a figure in white, has since been hailed as one of the greatest jump scares in horror history. While not a massive box office hit, it won respect for restoring seriousness to the franchise. Pazuzu's presence lingered more subtly here, as a background force of evil rather than the direct antagonist, reminding audiences that true horror lies in suggestion as much as spectacle. By the early 2000s, Hollywood had entered its reboot era. Exorcist, The Beginning, 2004, and Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist, 2005, offered competing visions of Father Merrin's first battle with Pazuzu in Africa. Both suffered from studio interference, with the same project essentially shot twice by different directors. Neither fully captured the original's power, though they offered more explicit depictions of Pazuzu as a demonic presence haunting Merrin's past. These films demonstrated the challenge of origin stories in horror. The more you explain a monster, the less terrifying it often becomes. Pazuzu, once mysterious and ambiguous, risked being reduced to just another CGI boogeyman. Television had its own take. In 2016, the Exorcist series premiered, running for 2 seasons. It was both a sequel and a reimagining, introducing new characters while eventually tying back to Regan MacNeil and the events of the original film. The show leaned into serialized storytelling, exploring how possession could manifest across families, institutions, and even the church hierarchy. Though critically praised for its atmosphere and performances, it struggled with ratings and was cancelled in 2018. Still, it showed that the mythology of The Exorcist could adapt to longer-form storytelling, with Pazuzu again shifting roles, sometimes a direct villain, sometimes more of a symbolic shadow. On the lighter side, The Exorcist became one of the most parodied horror films of all time. From Saturday Night Live sketches to Scary Movie 2, from Repossessed starring Linda Blair herself to endless references in The Simpsons, the spinning head and pea soup became comedy shorthand for possession. In a way, this cemented Pazuzu as an icon even further. True horror characters only become timeless once they can be both feared and laughed at. Dracula had his cape, Freddy Krueger had his claws, Pazuzu had projectile vomit. Most recently, the franchise was revived in 2023 with The Exorcist. Believer intended as the first in a new trilogy. Produced by Blumhouse, it aimed to do what the Halloween revival did, ignore the lesser sequels and position itself as a direct continuation of the original. Ellen Burstyn returned as Chris MacNeil, lending the new film credibility, while Pazuzu once again loomed in the background. The reception was mixed, with critics divided over whether the attempt succeeded in recapturing the original's power. But what was clear is that even 50 years later, the brand of The Exorcist still carried weight. Across these sequels, prequels, and parodies, Pazuzu's role shifted constantly. In the original, he was a shadowy, almost undefined force, terrifying precisely because audiences knew so little about him. In The Heretic, he was almost over-explained into irrelevance. In Exorcist III, he became a subtle background influence. In the prequels, he was elevated into an ancient nemesis of Father Merrin. And in modern revivals, he's both a throwback to the original and a test of whether horror can still scare in a world where audiences have seen it all. What this strange Exorcist cinematic universe reveals is the difficulty of sustaining a horror icon. Unlike slashers such as Freddy or Jason, who return again and again with familiar gimmicks, Pazuzu isn't a personality. He's an idea, an ancient force of evil, half forgotten but never gone. That makes him more flexible, but also harder to pin down. Each adaptation redefines him, either too vaguely or too concretely, and in that constant reinvention lies both the strength and weakness of the franchise. In the end, what the sequels and spin-offs show is that The Exorcist was lightning in a bottle. The original struck the perfect balance between mystery and terror, theology and spectacle. Every attempt since has struggled with the same challenge: how to make the invisible visible without losing its power. Pazuzu, born in Mesopotamian mythology and reborn on screen in 1973, remains one of horror's strangest icons, not because of consistency, but because of how often he has been reshaped to fit the fears of each new era. From the moment Regan MacNeil's eyes rolled back and her voice dropped into guttural growls, audiences sensed that The Exorcist was doing more than just trying to scare them. Yes, the spinning head and the levitation were shocking, but beneath the spectacle was something deeper. Possession in the film wasn't just about a demon in a child, it was a metaphor, a canvas onto which an entire generation projected its fears. For many parents in the 1970s, Regan's transformation felt uncomfortably familiar. Here was a sweet, innocent child suddenly becoming violent, unrecognizable, and uncontrollable. It wasn't hard to connect that to the universal terror of adolescence, the idea that your child can become a stranger overnight. Puberty, rebellion, mood swings, independence. In a sense, possession is a supernatural exaggeration of that developmental rupture. Blatty and Friedkin may not have set out to make a movie about teenage rebellion, but the symbolism was clear enough to strike home with any parent watching their daughter scream obscenities in a voice that no longer sounded like her own. At the same time, The Exorcist staged a battle between two forms of authority, medical and spiritual. Much of the film is spent watching doctors poke, prod, and scan Regan, only to shrug and admit they have no answers. Medicine, the great promise of modernity, is shown as powerless against her condition. Only when the priests arrive does the story shift toward resolution. In the early 1970s, when trust in institutions was already cracking under the weight of Vietnam and Watergate, this tension between science and faith carried enormous weight. Was modernity enough to protect us from evil, or did we still need the old rituals and prayers? The film refused to give an easy answer, but its imagery suggested that the sterile machines of the hospital were no match for the raw incantations of the church. The Cold War context added yet another layer. This was a world obsessed with infiltration, corruption, and ideological possession. Americans feared communist influence, nuclear annihilation, and the collapse of traditional values. In that environment, Regan's possession could easily be read as a metaphor for cultural infection, an innocent American home infiltrated by an ancient, invisible force. The family unit, symbolic of stability, is torn apart by something no one can see until it's too late. Just as Cold War propaganda warned of hidden corruption spreading quietly, The Exorcist dramatized that fear in the form of a child taken over from within. The Catholic rite of exorcism, almost unknown to the wider public before 1973, suddenly became the cultural shorthand for confronting evil. Images of priests holding crucifixes, sprinkling holy water, and commanding demons in the name of Christ became instantly recognizable symbols. Even people with no connection to Catholicism understood the iconography. From that point onward, whenever possession appeared in pop culture, from low-budget horror films to cartoons to comedy sketches, it borrowed the framework Friedkin had burned into the collective imagination. Exorcism was no longer a hidden ritual in Latin, it was a universal language of horror. But the interpretation of possession varied depending on where the film landed. In America, with its large Catholic population, many audiences took the story at face value as a terrifyingly realistic portrayal of the devil's work. Priests reported being contacted by frightened families asking for exorcisms. The church itself both condemned and cautiously endorsed the film, torn between discomfort and recognition that it had reignited interest in faith. In more secular societies, however, the film was read less literally. For them, possession was a metaphor for modern anxieties, the loss of control in a rapidly changing world, the breakdown of tradition under the pressures of modernity, the helplessness of parents in the face of forces they couldn't understand. That flexibility is exactly why possession horror has kept returning in new forms ever since. Every generation finds its own meaning in the image of a body hijacked by an unseen power. In the 1970s, it was fear of cultural corruption and the crisis of faith. In the 2000s, films like Paranormal Activity reframed possession as domestic terror in the age of surveillance. In the 2010s, movies like The Conjuring revived it as part of a broader nostalgia for based on a true story horror. And in recent years, possession stories have reflected anxieties about technology, mental illness, and the fragility of identity itself. The essence of possession horror is its malleability. It can mean puberty, it can mean politics, it can mean addiction, trauma, or ideology. At its core, it dramatizes the ultimate human fear, losing control of your own body, your own voice, your own mind. That's why Pazuzu, an obscure Mesopotamian wind demon, could be plucked from ancient mythology and still resonate in a Georgetown bedroom. That's why priests reciting Latin incantations could feel relevant to a modern, secular audience. Possession speaks to something that transcends time and culture, the dread of being consumed by something we can't fight or explain. This is why The Exorcist wasn't just another horror flick, and why possession remains a staple of the genre. Demons are more than monsters. They are metaphors, shifting, elusive, and adaptable to the anxieties of every new era. They let us dress our deepest fears in the guise of a supernatural enemy, so we can watch the battle play out on screen and pretend, for a moment, that the war can be won. By the time the new millennium rolled around, something strange had happened to The Exorcist. The film that once sent audiences sprinting out of theaters had become funny. Not intentionally, of course. But images that once shocked, Regan's spinning head, the projectile vomit, the guttural voice, snarling obscenities, were now being replayed in comedy sketches, parodies, and eventually, internet memes. What had been a cultural earthquake in 1973 was now pop culture comfort food, a shorthand for scary movie itself. The first big transformation came with parody. In 1990, Linda Blair herself starred in Repossessed, a spoof that turned her demonic ordeal into slapstick comedy. A decade later, Scary Movie 2 cemented the trend, opening with a grotesque but ridiculous riff on the possession scenes. Audiences roared with laughter at what had once made their parents faint. The crucifix scene, once whispered about in scandal, was now played for crude gags. Even The Simpsons got in on the act, with Regan-inspired moments appearing in Halloween specials. The imagery was too iconic not to parody, and in being parodied it lost some of its sting. As the internet age dawned, The Exorcist found a second life as meme material. Clips of Regan's head spin circulated on YouTube with added sound effects. TikTok edits layered her screams over dance tracks. Reaction GIFs of the vomiting scene became a way to express disgust online. Horror fans began sharing screamer videos in the early 2000s, innocent-looking clips that suddenly cut to Regan's possessed face with a jump-scare shriek. Millions of people who had never even seen the full film still recognized the demon girl from those viral pranks. Pazuzu, once an ancient Mesopotamian spirit of plagues, had been reduced to internet shock humor. The irony is obvious. What was once terrifying enough to spark protests and bans had become so familiar that it was practically cozy. The more an image circulates, the less frightening it becomes. When you can buy Regan masks at every Halloween store, when her spinning head is a novelty toy, when kids use her face in TikTok edits, the question becomes, can Pazuzu still scare us? The answer, oddly enough, is yes, but not in the same way. Pazuzu as a meme isn't frightening, but possession as a genre still has power. Films like The Conjuring series, Hereditary, and The Exorcism of Emily Rose prove that audiences remain fascinated by the concept of spiritual invasion. These films echo The Exorcist in form and tone. The skeptical investigators, the terrified families, the battle between faith and reason. The Conjuring in particular borrows heavily from Friedkin's blueprint, grounding its supernatural shocks in a documentary-like realism. When audiences watch Lorraine and Ed Warren confront demonic forces, they're watching a 21st century remix of the same cultural fears that The Exorcist first dragged into the mainstream. The difference lies in the layering. Modern possession films know that audiences have already seen Regan levitate, already watched a head spin 360 degrees, so they escalate. They push further with special effects, with backstories, with jump scares. Where The Exorcist thrived on ambiguity and restraint, modern films often rely on spectacle. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it falls flat, but all of them are chasing the same ghost. The memory of that first time audiences saw a child turned into a monster and believed, if only for 2 hours, that it might be possible. So while Pazuzu as a Halloween mask may not keep anyone up at night, his cultural DNA is everywhere. Every time a character's body twists unnaturally, every time a priest brandishes a crucifix, every time a trailer whispers, based on a true story, the shadow of the exorcist looms. The meme may have dulled the edge, but the archetype remains razor sharp. Horror evolves, but it never forgets its icons. In the meme age, then, Pazuzu is both punchline and progenitor. He is the face that made horror legitimate, and the face that people now laugh at in reaction gifs. And maybe that duality is exactly why he endures. If a demon can terrify one generation and amuse the next, it proves he's more than just a movie monster. He's a cultural mirror, reflecting our fears, our laughter, and our inability to stop looking at the darkness, even when we turn it into a joke. Half a century after its release, The Exorcist still stands in two worlds at once. On the one hand, it is timeless theological horror, a story about faith, doubt, and the terrifying possibility that evil isn't just an idea, but a presence. On the other hand, it is a pop culture icon reduced to Halloween masks, memes, and parodies. The same spinning head that once sent people fleeing from theaters now gets laughs on TikTok. Yet, that paradox is what makes it endure. Few films can both terrify and amuse across generations, and fewer still can claim to have changed the cultural landscape forever. When we talk about The Exorcist, we're really talking about layers of history stacked on top of each other. At its deepest root is Pazuzu, an ancient Mesopotamian wind demon who once protected mothers and babies from harm. On top of that lies the Christian tradition of exorcism, codified in ritual and fear of Satan. Then comes the Maryland case of 1949, whispers in Jesuit diaries about a boy tormented by something beyond medicine. William Peter Blatty turned that into a novel, William Friedkin turned the novel into a film, and audiences turned the film into a cultural earthquake. From sacred ritual to bestseller to meme, the journey of The Exorcist is the story of how myths evolve in the modern age. That's why dismissing it as just another horror flick misses the point. Yes, today the special effects can look dated. The pea soup is campy. The spinning head has been parodied into absurdity. But the power of The Exorcist doesn't rest on the tricks. It rests on the questions it asks. What if the devil is real? What if science isn't enough? What if even faith can falter? Those questions don't age. They only shift with the anxieties of each new generation. And that's the genius of possession stories in general. They are endlessly adaptable. For the 1970s, possession spoke to Cold War paranoia, cultural upheaval, and the crisis of authority. For later audiences, it became a way to process fears of technology, trauma, and identity. Every version is different, but the skeleton remains the same. A body becomes a battleground, and everyone watching wonders whether they, too, could lose control. So maybe Pazuzu as a meme isn't a bad thing. Maybe the fact that we can laugh at him and still be unnerved by his shadow in modern films shows his true power. Horror icons only become timeless when they transcend their original stories. Dracula left his castle, Freddy left Elm Street, and Pazuzu, improbably, left Mesopotamia and found his way into every corner of global culture. Which brings us to one final, practical note. If you ever hear scratching in the walls, or your kid suddenly starts speaking Latin backwards, maybe don't assume it's just hormones. And if Pazuzu shows up in your bedroom, definitely don't leave the crucifix in the drawer. Now, the question is, which other demons of horror should we unmask next? From folklore to film, from the ancient to the absurd, there are plenty of shadows left to chase. Drop your suggestions in the comments, and let's decide who deserves the next deep dive, because the only thing scarier than these demons is how much fun we'll have digging them up again. I hope you enjoyed this story. If you liked it and want to listen to more, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.